Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos, the man who puts the gent into Don't Cry For Me, Argentina. Yes. Well, there's a big clue for one of the shows we're going to be talking about today. In fact, we have a very interesting selection of shows today, only two, written at a very similar time in the late 1970s, and yet utterly different. So, for the main part of the programme, you're going to be listening to Tim Saywood and myself talking about the recent London production of Evita, that evergreen show, which started off as an album in 1976, and then became a West End smash, and of course a huge hit on Broadway, and then subsequently a film, and has since become a perennial evergreen, he said, mixing his gardening terms. Evita by Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice, and I think my favourite of all the shows that those two have written together or apart. But then, later in the programme, we're going to have a real blast from the past, because I recently rediscovered a lost recording of Tim Saywood and myself made in 2008, in the very early days of Musical Talk's life. And in that 10-minute section, we discussed the life and work of the late, great Dick Vosburgh, an American lyricist who'd lived in London for many, many years and was involved in both our comedy writing scene and also our musical theatre scene. And he's still much lamented. And as part of that, we reviewed a recently repeated radio version of one of his shows called A Night in the Ukraine. It's actually Act 2 of a two-part show called A Day in Hollywood, A Night in the Ukraine, which has a very interesting model to it, in the sense that the first act is a review about old-time cinema, if you like, pre-war cinema cliches. In fact, there's a song called I Love a Cliché, and a rather marvellous Richard Whiting medley. Now, Richard Whiting was responsible for On the Good Ship Lollipop, but forgive him for that, because he also wrote an awful lot of good songs. But it's the second act of that show, A Day in Hollywood and A Night in the Ukraine, which had been turned into a radio programme, because the two acts really are completely separate. And the conceit of that Act 2, A Night in the Ukraine, is that they took Chekov's The Bear, a Russian comic short story, and musicalised it and adapted it as though it was starring the Marx Brothers. And it was, of course, a musical, written by Dick Vosburgh and Frank Lazarus, the famous Groucho Marx impersonator. It's only a 10-minute clip, and I think you can hear how far we've moved on here in Musical Talk over the 11 years of our existence. However, I've included it because it's a musical we've not really discussed before, and it's interesting occasionally to look back at one's roots. So, to sum up, later in the programme we'll hear an old archive recording of a review of A Night in the Ukraine by Dick Vosburgh and Frank Lazarus, but first, it's Tim Saywood extolling the virtues of that great piece of 1970s musical theatre, Evita. Musical Talk. So, Tim, hello.
Hello.
You recently, I think, went to see what could only be described as a circus, a musical theatre circus.
Well, also a show. What a circus, what a show, one could say. Yes, that's right. It was the West End production of Evita, which has been running at the Phoenix Theatre for, I forget how long it was for, to be honest. I'm going to have to admit straight out here that although I'm quite keen to talk about this, I meant to bring the programme with me today, so I don't know who anyone who was in it was. And I'm relying on my sort of memory here of the performance. The performance was very recent, and Evita is a musical I've known a very long time, and I had the album of the one with Patti LuPone, who wasn't in the cast of this particular production.
But you're able to do a remembrance of things past.
Absolutely, yeah. And I can't remember if it was the one with David Essex as well as Che, but again...
That was the original, wasn't it?
That was the very beginning. Well, I can't remember if it was West End first or Broadway first, actually, but I suspect it was West End first, and that seemed to be the way. And it's an interesting thing in that it falls a little after Jesus Christ Superstar, so they'd sort of done...
And in chronological terms, i.e. in real life, many, many years after.
Yes, indeed, yes. It's a big flash forward in that whole sort of canon. In fact, it really is, because up to this point we've had Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, a Bible story, which, as scholars of the subject know, happened way, way back many centuries ago. And then, of course, Jesus Christ Superstar, which is about some 2,000 years ago.
Well, that's helpfully date. In fact, the entire
Yes.
calendar system is predicated around it.
They actually point out, with admirable scholarship in the musical, especially for a musical, in Jesus Christ Superstar, in the very final, in the climactic song called Jesus Christ Superstar, that everything happened in 4 BC. Israel in 4 BC had no mass communication, so they date it very precisely, and then they moved on to Evita, and it's a sort of interesting development really at this point. They've done Joseph, which is a kids show, and it's and the score very much partakes of that, and it's quite sort of jokey and pastiche all the way through. And Jesus Christ Superstar has some serious bits, which are sort of the rock parts, and it has 1 or 2 silly pastiche numbers as well, like Herod's song and so on. And Evita follows on from this thing about where they've done this media savvy sort of musical about Jesus Christ as a media phenomenon. That's fundamentally what Jesus Christ Superstar is.
Part.
It's about the mythologization of Christ, and so of course they have a ready-made subject in the form of Evita, because it's exactly the same premise and it's exactly the same story. And in the character of Che, who opens the whole thing with "Oh, what a circus, what a show," you've basically got the same character as Judas in Jesus Christ Superstar. And I hadn't really noticed that until I watched watched this, as it were, with that sort of retrospective view,
There is a difference, though, isn't it? Because the Che Guevara character is a much more of an observer character. He doesn't really.
Yeah, no, he's not a participant.
Yeah,
that's
he is
right.
a proper narrator.
In fact, he's held at a complete distance. He, as you say, yes, he doesn't interact with the protagonists in any way, shape, or form throughout the thing, except in a fantasy sequence that's in the second act, which is the waltz of Ava and Che. Of course, it's never.
Which is cut to the ballet in anything from the previous 50 years.
Yeah. Actually, yeah, it kind of is the dream ballet of Evita, that particular moment, except with words. So, and I took a young.
Was there a place for them?
I took a young relative to see it, and so it was kind of interesting to see how this sort of it's very different watching a musical by yourself with somebody who's really into musicals, and then if you bring somebody who is or isn't, or hasn't exactly, who doesn't know the thing, then you can't help yourself but watch it in a slightly different way, because you're just suddenly conscious about, I wonder what this person's thinking about it. And so I sort of went through that experience really, just looking at it as a piece, because when and of course this is how all of the early Andrew Lloyd Webbers were done, was by the album being released and by everybody getting to know the album backwards before they even went near the theatre. In my case, the gap being a good sort of 30 years between hearing the album and finally seeing a live version of it. And so of course you don't tend to sort of worry about following the plot or anything like that when you get into the theatre. It's not an issue. But it had been such a long time since I'd even heard the album that it was worth seeing. And it does basically make sense, and it's the story, as I'm sure many people know, of Ava Duarte, who works her way through the ranks, as it were, of Argentinian society until she marries Juan Perón, and then comes within a whisker of being vice president. I don't know if they were thinking of Hillary Clinton when they...
I mean, you can make some parallels if you want to make some parallels.
Well, yeah, you could. Although where that would fall down immediately is that Ava Duarte was from a very underprivileged background. In fact, she literally was a member of the second family of a middle-class Argentinian man who had a first family... or a subsequent family who were, effectively she was a sort of a
cast-off, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, she was an illegitimate child of this father, but she did go to the funeral. They were actually sort of invited as the second family, and it underlines, I think, a little bit about sort of how they painted characters at that stage, and I think it's never been an enormous strength, if I'm absolutely honest, of Lloyd Webber.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're talking about the composer and the writer here.
Yes, Tim Rice and Lloyd Webber. So, if you look at what they'd done up to that point, well, they hadn't really created very complete characters for Joseph, because it wasn't a necessary part of how that musical worked. They hadn't necessarily created very complete characters for Jesus Christ Superstar, partly because they had these sort of iconic status, if you like, for the man himself. Although arguably they do it slightly less successfully here with Evita, because people are very much motivated by their ambition in this, and or by their ideology, and you don't see so much of their inner life. Yeah, exactly. And I don't think Evita is really given one beyond sort of a lot of emoting, which of course comes out in that climactic number, Don't Cry For Me, Argentina.
Isn't there also, however, at one level I agree with what you're saying, but isn't it possible to argue, and you must tell me I'm retconning this.
Yeah.
But bearing in mind the Argentinian public per se are a part of Evita as a musical.
Yes.
They are projecting,
chorus,
but they project onto her this sort of
Santa Evita.
Yeah, this sort of saintly character almost. She is the character that they need.
Yeah.
She's almost the Diana of her period, as I suspect, as the nearest speech to modern connection. But they project onto her, and therefore, the moment you're projected onto, if there's any deviation from what they're projecting onto you from who you are, and there clearly is here, then actually it's all about image and cipher and gap, isn't it? That you can project onto someone, and they have to have something within them that allows that to happen, or they can build an image.
I think that's what's interesting, really, is that they do a lot with that image part of it and the creation of the image, and I think a lot of that is done very well. I think you don't necessarily see what was there to begin with.
But if you wrote the story to make her a real person, as it were, you saw more of the real Evita underneath. Wouldn't that then also, within the confines of the piece, play down? You wouldn't be able to delineate the image so well. It will work against the central point of the piece, is what I suppose I'm badly trying to say.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it is the sort of whole appearance reality thing, and the critique that is offered by Che in the thing is that basically, he's obviously motivated by ideology and has a specific thing that he wants to achieve, and it's all Karl Marx based and whatever, whereas Evita is sort of improvisatory,
pragmatic.
No, perhaps not even that, because I think there's the Eva Peron Foundation, which is sort of rather satirised in a piece later on in the second act, is sort of improvisatory. It's sort of, she sort of picks random people for quite generous acts of charity, and it's not a sort of systematic attempt to to address poverty. It's sort of a bit of a circus and a bit of a show, funnily enough. Yes, it's almost as if they were bang on target. A great favourite of mine, that particular piece, actually, so the money kept rolling in, and it's in 7. He used to do a lot of that sort of stuff.
Clever time signatures.
Yeah, where it was in a sort of da 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 like that.
Which also, oddly, I mean, in my untutored non-musical ear, sounds exotically South American.
Well, it is a Latin. Yeah, I mean, you would get. Yeah, it is a very. It's one of the more Latin songs in the whole thing, actually. I mean, so it's sort of an interesting thing. It's the last. Well, I don't know if it's the last cry of Rice and Lloyd Webber, but certainly you've got things like Cats are starting to get into the offing at this point, and his collaborations with other people, such as Phantom is obviously not yet thought of, but is sort of bubbling under. So really, this was the last big. And of course, Tell Me on a Sunday was coming up as well, which of course was Don Black.
So it's coming towards the end of his first phase.
Yeah, exactly.
For both of them, in fact, actually.
Exactly. Yeah. And they basically sort of have gone through this sort of just telling the myth to critiquing the myth to critiquing another myth. That's the sort of thing that they did. It's a very interesting sort of trajectory they went on, and it was a huge risk to write about Evita, because I think although she would have been somewhat known about by the prospective audience, I think probably more she wouldn't have been known about, because it's not Latin American politics. It's not like a daily breakfast table conversation, even in the 70s,
I mean, she is handed down to history through this musical, at least in Britain.
Pretty much, yeah, and probably in America to a certain extent as well. So yeah, it was an interesting sort of thing, and of course it had one restoration, which is that for those who know the film with Madonna, that has got a number which shows the rise to power of Juan Perón, which is in the film a number called "The Lady's Got Potential," which is a big, fairly hard rock number with some reasonably atrocious lyrics. And
can I just say how wonderful the qualifier of reasonably is in front of atrocious.
Some of them are good, some of them are abysmal. And that was originally a song which we saw here called "The Art of the Possible," which is a much more understated, weird sort of a song. I can't tell exactly how they chose the scale of it, but it has a very oddly shifting melody, almost Arabic sort of type of scale in it, and that is interestingly staged because you don't see that on the recording how it works, but they show it's literally done as a game of musical chairs with the politicians, because it was a series of coups that brought Perón to power. So of course you have the initial president, and then and then one of his cabinet is sort of bundled off, and then there's one fewer chair, and then another member of the sort of junta is, although the president himself is then bundled off, and then someone else moves up into his position. It's done quite it's a nice little
witty representation.
It is. Yeah, it's a not, you can't whistle it, and that's probably why they cut it and changed it to something a bit more. And it's not very filmic because it's very stagey.
Yes, it sounds absolutely representative and symbolic, isn't it, rather than pseudo-realistic, which films have to sort of aim to be normally.
This production had a very sort of a set that sort of stayed very much in situ throughout the whole thing, and it felt very much more like a theatre piece than the film, which I suppose is kind of unsurprising.
Well, it's interesting to me, however, that I had completely forgotten it had been turned into a film.
Yes.
So I wonder how significant and important Evita, the film, is in real terms.
I
think it may be more of a throwaway than the show.
I remember seeing that, when that came out, and so I suppose that was when I first saw the thing dramatised rather than just knowing the album.
But can I ask, have you ever seen it again?
Yes.
You have seen it?
Yeah, I have. I have it on DVD, I think, as well. I've seen 2 or 3 times. I've probably seen it, and it's got the great thing that they did with the film is they really opened out the musical in a way that I think worked by and large. It was by Alan Parker was the director, and there was a lot more location stuff. There was a lot more. It just opened it out a lot. It found bits that were stagey and cut them and replaced them, and it also added another song. Where do we go from here? Which actually, interestingly, they had put in the stage version that I saw, despite it's being written for the film originally. Right, okay. And I think it's because there's just a little bit of a gap in the narrative at that point that they realised that they hadn't really bridged correctly, and they got very quickly to from Ava being sort of going on the Rainbow Tour to her sort of collapsing and not being
alive.
Well, they didn't. Ultimately, they didn't cut her death. That part was in there originally, but it does have this slightly unfortunate effect by chucking in the number at that point of having that slightly sort of La Boheme type of interminable hovering at the doors of death, coughing vulnerably in between like extremely loud solicitations.
I've got a question for you. A friend of this programme, Mike Shapiro, who writes in his own right, is very interested in the concept of there being a character that the audience can root for.
Yeah.
Evita is not an easy character to like. She's not an easy character to sympathise, although at one level she's a strong woman in a male environment, although she does use she uses the men. I think that's she is used by men.
I think that's right. I think that's how it begins. You do sort of, I don't know if you root for her exactly. I mean, it does have this sort of very big detachment, the same as Jesus Christ Superstar did. Now, I think in Jesus Christ Superstar, they would have been relying on the fact that people would generally be rooting for Christ.
He is, speech marks, the good guy.
Yes, and indeed, I think that they do manage to portray him in such a way that you see some of the dilemmas and stuff. It's more subtle than just sort of him being this adored figure. I mean, it's a lot about that. And you also have a very sympathetic figure in Judas as well. Who again doesn't believe the hype and for that reason really is motivated to go on to betray Jesus. And here you do have that same dynamic, but you've got, I suppose if you're looking at her, she's a very young girl. She's supposed to be 15 at the beginning. A very difficult thing to portray, but you do sort of see someone who has been scorned by the world, and I think they do manage to put that in a little bit unsubtly, but they do manage to do it.
So it gives her a motivation that one can connect with.
So that gives her motivation.
She takes it a long way, though, doesn't she?
Yeah, indeed. Well, indeed, yeah. Don't look down. It's a long, long way to fall. In fact, it's one of the the lyrics. I
want to go back to your Jesus Christ observation. Funnily enough, that the idea that Judas is actually one of the few sort of rationalists in that setup. You can see what's really going on rather than buying into the hype. Oddly, and this is a very odd resonance, but that's very much the Gilbertian approach, that you have a world of strangeness and wrongness and inversion, but then you always have one character who's the one who tells the truth, who's the rationalist, who's always the villain, or at least the sort of the pseudo bad guy. I think Judas has got a bad rap.
Exactly. Well, I think the bigger debt here is to Brecht. And to the whole sort of notion of not necessarily.
I'm not for 1 second saying that they were using Gilbert. I'm just saying there's a Gilbertian.
Well, I mean, Lloyd Webber would have been was very aware, probably more so of them than of Brecht, I think. He was probably more aware of Brecht via, I don't know, the Kander and Ebbs who were practising around that same time. And of course Harold Prince was involved was the first director of Evita, I think. So I'm sure a lot of the same things that he brought into Company and Sweeney Todd at that time, would have also been part of his vision.
Injected in. Yeah.
Yes, exactly, for how the whole thing came together. But yeah, so it is a very political piece of theatre, albeit not necessarily expressed in the most subtle terms. But then there we are, it's Brecht all over. But arguably, yeah.
Question for you then. I mean, Evita has a claim, I think, to be, and I'm setting Phantom of the Opera to one side, but if you took that away, I think it would be easy to argue that Evita is the most successful Andrew Lloyd Webber musical.
You mean artistically?
Yes, I would think so.
I'm just trying to think if I can think of
I can't think of one I like better.
I think Phantom is a more complete piece, and I think he's written more in his comfort zone. But I think Evita is certainly is a good, for those that sort of value the types of things in Evita, I suppose, that would make it a good second.
The only reason I ask it is because I actually do think, please don't send me hate mail, but I think Phantom is a load of old balderdash. Whereas actually I really enjoyed Evita when I saw it. It was being musically directed by the very lovely Andrew Corcoran when I saw it years ago.
Yeah. Well, I just think it is more detached, and I think what Phantom has going for it is the amazing score and so on, and I think much stronger lyrics, to be honest, than most of the Tim Rice stuff. But it's true that after Phantom, I think Lloyd Webber, for me, goes completely off the ball, and it's because he stops doing interesting musical things. Evita is full of weirdnesses, and in fact, if you listen to Chess, which I know Lloyd Webber was not the composer on, it was all Thos and so on. But that almost is the success to Evita, because that same sort of slightly cynical, detached ethos, and indeed the sort of comparative musical sophistication, is there in Chess, which you don't really hear much of in Lloyd Webber subsequent to Evita, Tell Me on a Sunday, I suppose. Well, Cats you do get it in a little bit, but it does tend to disappear a bit after Phantom. So I think Evita is a good avatar of that era of his writing. I suppose the Requiem as well. But where there's just stuff in there that is comparatively a difficult listen, and actually nonetheless works fairly dramatically. Of course,
the better for it.
There are criticisms of it where it suffers from that same thing that all of his musicals do, where sort of random bits of musical material come around for no particularly obvious reason. One interesting thing that I'd easily overlooked, although of course I did know this, but I'd forgotten. I was chatting to somebody else about Evita, who said, yeah, I don't, I really like What a Circus, What a Show, but I can't stand Don't Cry for Me, Argentina. And after a couple of minutes, I thought, they're the same tune. And the whole thing, all the way through, is the same tune, but just done in this rather different style. And that sort of makes sense in the sense that it's the What a Circus, What a Show is an opening thing. It's a sort of parodies almost the way that she presented herself in Don't Cry for Me, Argentina, except that that's meant to be a moment of great authenticity, so I don't know.
But is it?
Well, I mean, quite. You know.
I mean, you say that, but actually, or is it not just the masterstroke?
I think we're looking
of a great media player.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, we're looking
once
at
again
an
the
actress.
Diana thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Did anyone ever? The Martin Bashir thing. Oh, we saw the real her.
No,
I don't think we did.
Not really. Yeah, I don't know. Who knows? Who knows as to that? It's a great piece, though, and I'm glad it was revived, and I think it survived better than I expected it to. Actually, partly because the subject, has. We're seeing, as we always will, but yet again we're seeing this whole business of politics as show business is sort of at the top of the agenda at the moment. So actually, having started by sort of saying, well, you might think of Hillary Clinton, you might equally think of Donald Trump, and and that sort of.
But basically, you take whichever American politician you fancy.
Yeah, in terms of the incoherence of his project, and and I think it sort of. It has that contemporary resonance. Yeah, good show though. Yeah, so I think it's so I think it is pleased. I'm pleased to see it revived, and actually I enjoyed it a good deal more than I expected to. And in fact, I was happier to see that, I think, than some of the sort of earlier musicals that we've seen revived, the old Half a Sixpences and whatnot, that have recently been made their way across the West End stages. This had a bit of bite to it, and I think that's good. So I wasn't crying at the end.
It's also been disinterred much more successfully than she was.
Well, indeed, yes. Well, of course she was disinterred
several times.
Yes,
didn't they lose the body in the end?
They have. That's right. No, I think in the end it was recovered. I think, but the musical ends with this rather beautiful, just little epilogue. They don't really go into the whole what happened to her body thing because it's sort of a different story yet again.
It's not really what it's about, is it?
But it does say that she was buried and then her body went missing for 15 years. ... And that's the end of the musical. Yeah. And they don't really go into the fact that it was then recovered and reinterred, I believe. But yeah, it's a lovely little coda. But as to the musical, I'm glad to see that revived.
Thank you very much. Musical talk. We're about to discuss the lost Marx Brothers musical, A Night in the Ukraine, although actually it's the second act of a wider musical called A Day in Hollywood, A Night in the Ukraine.
Yes, which goes to both locations, I believe. It's very expensive to put on.
It's a show from 1979 in the West End, went to Broadway in 1980.
It wasn't actually the West End at the beginning, it was the New End Theatre Hampstead, which is a fringe theatre.
But then it went to the Mayfair.
That's right.
And it ran for 168 performances in London and 588 in America, interestingly. Where it was the Royal Theatre and was choreographed by Tommy Tune.
Oh, yes, the well-known Tommy Tune.
Who actually won an award for it. I think got Tony
Michael
for that.
Bennett's protege, I think, or not even a protege, possibly even a contemporary.
Well, he choreographed an awful lot, but he's also appeared in a couple of musicals. He was in a Gershwin collation with Twiggy, I think.
Yeah, well.
But A Day in Hollywood, A Night in the Ukraine was written by the late Dick Vosburgh.
Yes.
It's worth touching upon him briefly, I think, before we talk about the musical. Well, he was an American, but who came to RADA as a very young man. It's the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art here in London, where he met his wife and ended up working for the BBC, as many actors do. They end up as writers.
He met his wife? What was she doing here?
She had no idea. He provided scripts for Bernard Braden, who was the forerunner. If you know anything about British television, Bernard Braden did programmes that were very similar to Esther Ranson's later shows.
Oh, okay.
And he wrote the comic material for that. Eventually ended up working with British writers like Barry Cryer and wrote a lot of sitcoms for people like Ronnie Corbett.
So how did he get back to musicals?
Well, he always loved musicals. He always wrote lyrics in his spare time. He often rewrote lyrics to old songs from other countries.
Yep.
And he wrought 3 musicals that he's most well known for. This one, which I've mentioned already, A Day in Hollywood, A Night in Ukraine, with Frank Lazarus, who's most famous as the Groucho Marx impressionist extraordinaire.
Yes, indeed.
A musical called Windy City, based on the Thos, The Front Page, or His Girl Friday.
Yep. Oh, yes.
In 1982. And finally, A Saint She Ain't, which he wrote with Dennis King. Dennis King being the composer of, well, probably most famously the Black Beauty theme tune.
Yes.
But also several other songs and musicals.
Right.
And he died, unfortunately, in 2007. But he had...
But this show certainly doesn't, does it? Die, I mean.
Oh, no, it certainly doesn't at all. I mean, he has a reputation for meticulous lyric writing.
Yes.
And it's very clear that he's quite a polished lyricist, which we'll be discussing in a minute.
Yeah.
The conceit of the musical is Act 1 is set in the Grauman's Chinese Theatre.
Yep.
Which
New
is
York.
where many of the premieres take place, I think. And it's the ushers and the usherettes form a chorus line and sing hits of the 1930s. It's set in the 1930s. And so there's a long sequence of... It's in fact, a jukebox musical, Act 1. Mm-hmm. It's got a medley of songs by Richard Whiting, the father of Margaret Whiting, the Whiting, the singer, including The Japanese Sandman, Good Ship Lollipop, Double Trouble, Louise, Sleepy Time Gal, Beyond the Blue Horizon, and Thanks for the Memory.
Great, Grauman's Chinese Theatre in Hollywood, of course.
Yes, that's the one.
Where they've had the Oscar ceremony, I think, in the past. I can't remember.
Isn't it where the Walk with All the Stars in as well?
Ah, okay.
And I believe it might be where the original Pink Panther TV series car drew up, and the Pink Panther and the inspector will go in to observe the
collect
cartoons.
their Oscar, yes.
Yes, moving on. Act 1 is it's essentially it's a jukebox musical, but with some songs by Jerry Herman written specifically for them. There's one called Just Go to the Movies, which when you know that he wrote Mac and Mabel, you know he's really showing his roots there. There is a song by somebody called Trevor Littleton called I Love a Film Cliché. Dick Vosburgh wrote the lyrics for. And that's basically the middle. It talks about going to the cinema and seeing all these films and the lovely cliches. And then there's a lovely 5-minute section in the middle where they just string all these cliches together. And they finish up with Why am I telling you this? You a complete stranger. Me simple jungle princess. What mean this word kiss?
Yes.
No trial for us. We're for stringing him up right away.
Yes.
And hundreds of them, you can think of them.
Things.
There's lots of that kind of thing. So that's Act 1. Act 2 is probably the more interesting and stands alone. Indeed, Tim and I have recently had the pleasure of hearing a standalone version of Act 2, which is The Night in the Ukraine.
They did it on Radio 4.
That's right, in tribute to the late Dick Vosburgh at Christmas 2007. The conceit, well, what's the conceit of that?
Well, the conceit of that is it's based on a Chekov play called The Bear, which, funnily enough, I have a history with this play. I've once appeared in it. And it basically is where a creditor calls upon a widow in an estate. It's a three-hander, basically, with a few sort of random servants turning up at the end. And in essence, the woman is a widow. She's in mourning for her husband. She doesn't want to see anybody. A creditor turns up who her husband owed money to before he died. And they go through a long series of arguments. There's also an old servant as well, who's the sort of comic relief.
Aged retainer.
They're all, yes, exactly. They're all sort of comic. Eventually, they decide to fight a duel for the money, but in the course of preparing for that, he decides that he loves her, and they fall in love. I mean, it's a very light, fluffy, certainly for Chekov, sort of comedy. So yeah, that's pretty much the basic plot, and it's very wordy, very verbose. It's got some very long speeches by the guy himself. So it's fair to say it's altered quite well. The fundamental plot is the same, but quite a lot of the detail is different.
Well, yes, the conceit is that the Marx Brothers are inserted into this. Groucho plays Samovar the liar, who's the creditor character. Chico Marx is the aged retainer, and the widow's still there. There's also a subplot added, isn't there, of a son and a coachman who's a playwright, and the daughter of the widow.
Yes, they
fall in love,
romantic couple,
have an argument, and fall in love again.
Yeah,
and that's their subplot.
That's pretty much the plot. Yep.
But the main thing is the Groucho Marx material, which is done spot on. And once again, the book, and therefore the dialogue, was by Dick Vosburgh. The lyrics were by Dick Vosburgh. And the music, ironically, was by Frank Lazarus, who's the chap who now plays Groucho Marx in the production.
Pretty much all those things, and in Flywheel, Shyster and Flywheel, and many other radio versions of it.
Which Dick Vosburgh also wrote for.
Yes.
So they were a double writing act. A successful musical, would you say, Act 2?
Enormously successful. It's very witty. One of the things that it does most successfully, perhaps more successfully than, well, a lot of musicals really, is that it has funny lyrics. Now you might say there are a lot of funny lyric musicals, Avenue Q for example, but when you start to analyse them very closely, you notice that actually it's either like one big gag that comes at the beginning of the number, which is then just followed by sort of a series of riffs on or variations on the theme, or it's one of those things where there are, there's a few funny lines in it, but in this case, he really keeps them coming thick and fast. There's a lot of very funny lines in the songs in this.
Your angelic face I regard as the face of a saint,
Bernard.
And the pause is in
one
there.
Of the best comic lines I've ever heard, actually.
That's in a song called Natasha.
Yep.
There's another line, isn't there?
Yes, there is.
I can't remember exactly, but the essence of it is, you're the most attractive woman I've ever seen in Timbuktu, and then a whole list of countries. And that's not saying much for you.
For you, yes. And the rhyme and the structure, and there's a sort of expression that musical theatre dramaturgs and people like that use in sense of, I'm sure a lot of people use it, when they talk about the gag landing, and it sort of goes, and it lands at just the right moment to get maximum comic effect. And there's a lot of gags that really land very well in this.
But the version we heard was a radio production with a live audience. And the clever thing about that is, of course, if you're the songwriter, you also then have to tread water for just a second or two while people are laughing, so you don't miss the next gag.
That's right.
And that was also successful, I thought, because we were laughing away, chortling away all the way through it. And I don't think we missed any of the salient jokes. One
of the other features of it, of course, is that I find this slightly less funny than you do, I think, but there's a lot of excruciating rhymes and puns and stuff like that it's studied with. I don't mind things like that where I can't remember what the exact rhyme was, but there was one. What was it?
Puns or just...
No, there was a specific rhyme in the.
There's one rhyme I took which I rather liked, where it was a deliberate false rhyme. It was he rhymed promiscuous with hibiscus.
Promiscuous, with hibiscus.
Well, that's the way he said it.
But yes, that's right, and that that's kind of witty. I never really quite. It wasn't funny in itself, but it was a witty sort of bending of the rules, and that was what was funny about it.
I would like to pay tribute to Dick Vosburgh's dialogue. I think that it sounded like Groucho Marx, and basically it was joke after joke after joke.
Absolutely. And
what do they say? If it walks like a duck and it sounds like a duck, it's a duck.
It quacks like a duck. I think That's true, and I think what was particularly interesting about the structure, there were a few interlude scenes, scenes which are just composed of gags just because that's what they are, and they don't really relate to the plot. But actually, there was a surprising number of feed lines which were actually plot feed lines, and then the payoff was incidental to the plot. But where
it incorporated the both.
Yeah, for example, the Natasha, who is the Margaret Dumont figure, basically
the widow,
the widow, who's
the large widow.
The large widow. Lots of jokes about how fat she was, and.
Fate has thrown us together. No, it's what is
yes. She says, "Isn't it strange how fate has thrown us together?" And he says, "Well, he doesn't actually say, well, speak for yourself, but he possibly could have."
But he says, "It's strange how you've been thrown together."
Yes, that's right. It's about playing music, and you're certainly shaped like a piano and stuff like that. But a lot of her feed lines to his gags, that he pays off with frustrating things, very much as with Margaret Dumont, actually, are plot lines. She wants to know something, and then he just pays her off with a dreadful gag, bait and switch. Good stuff.
It was funny all round. Although I'm going to just pay tribute here because, as I say, Jerry Herman wrote some of the songs for the first act, not in the second act. But there's a song it's called Nelson, and it's supposedly Jeanette MacDonald singing to Nelson Eddy in those interminable Mountie films of the 30s.
Right, yes.
When I'm Calling You, those kind of musicals. It spoofs those.
Indian Love Call.
Yes, and she sings a lyric, a picture of strength and good breeding, of course, and of passion and warmth. Brackets, I'm discussing his horse. Jerry Herman
that's actually a lot. Well, that's good. Although it's a little bit creakier than I think what we heard in the night in Ukraine.
That's true, but I think Jerry Herman is one of the few composers who, when he puts his mind to it, can actually get a joke in. Musical theatre doesn't often call for that.
I think his jokes are a little bit gentler, and they go slightly less for the jugular. That's what I would, if I ever had to characterise, what typifies a Jerry Herman song, funny song. There's just a little bit more attack in the Dick Vosburgh lyrics.
Shall I read a couple of reviews just briefly?
Sure.
Sorry. It's been quite well reviewed. It gets revived occasionally. Here's a review from the internet. This recording is quite simply one of the all-time underrated gems in musical theatre history. And here's a rather splendid one. You probably shouldn't be drinking anything whilst listening to this CD for the first time, as you seriously run the risk of having it come right out of your nose when a lyrical barb comes out of nowhere.
Yeah.
All in all, we'd recommend this as a highly successful...
It's good. And actually, a lot of people say, the Marx Brothers original movies, of course, are sort of musicals in that...
Well, one's got a score by Irving Berlin.
For example. So, which would...
The Coconuts.
Oh, the Coconuts. Oh, okay. What about Animal Cracker? What's the one set in the university, the college football team?
That's Horse Feathers.
Horse Feathers, that's right. Which has, of course, famously the song "Everyone Says I Love You" as its sort of continual leitmotif.
And sung in unusual ways.
There's another Marx Brothers musical, of course, which is called Minnie's Boys, which is about the Marx Brothers rather than a riff on one of their films. But it's amazing how few Marx Brothers musicals are, and this one really should be better known because it's certainly the best one I've ever heard.
Well, it's
including their films.
Well, the Marx Brothers have now become characters of musical theatre fiction because obviously a great many of their early films were based on the shows that they did, and their characters wove in and out of the business.
Yeah.
And then, as I say, they were stage shows first, they became musicals, and then as they became legends and indeed passed away, people now revive the shows that they did and cast people to play Groucho Marx and Chico Marx and Harpo Marx and indeed Zeppo. So I was lucky enough to see Animal Crackers. I saw Animal Crackers in the round at the Barbican a few years ago. And
not a musical, this, but...
well, it is a musical.
Oh, it is, right.
Oh, absolutely. It's got songs all the way through it.
Yep.
It's the one, I believe it's... Well, I know it. It's the one with Hooray for Captain Spaulding.
Oh, yes.
It's Kalmar and Ruby are the writing team behind that.
Right.
Kalmar, of whom, like so many, a biopic was made a few years ago, starring Fred Astaire and Red Skelton.
Blimey.
It's called Three Little Words.
Quite a long time ago.
50s, 1950s. But that's quite an amusing film. But they were of significant note to have had a film made about them, and they wrote the score for that. So I think you can argue, and indeed we may yet do so on another show, perhaps. Look at the Marx Brothers' involvement in musical theatre.
Yeah.
Musical talk. Well, a little blast from the past there. I think Tim sounds fine on that recording, but I sound even more of a gibbering idiot than I do today. And before that, of course, a much more in-depth conversation about Evita. And before I finish this programme, I feel I must just very quickly mention one of my favourite clips from one of my favourite comedy television programmes. It was called The Goodies, and it was on throughout most of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s. And I loved it. I loved it as a child, and I love it as an adult. If you've never heard of it, the best way of thinking of it is as Monty Python's stepbrother. And there's one episode where Tim Brooke-Taylor models himself on a cross between Margaret Thatcher and Evita Peron. And in a bid to win an election, she speaks to ordinary people, one called Tina and one called Marge, who tell Timita, the name of the character, of all their woes, to which Tim then sings, wait for it, "Don't cry for me, Marge and Tina." I haven't done it justice. It's a brilliant clip, well worth catching. It's probably on YouTube somewhere. As indeed are selected episodes of Musical Talk, so perhaps go and look for us there as well. But for the time being, I think it is time for me to say goodbye. It usually is. I usually leave it far too late. In fact, I'm hanging it out now by just carrying on talking. So I will stop carrying on talking, eventually, and get on to the actual point, which is to say goodbye. And here's me doing it now. Goodbye. Oh, didn't he take a long time? This episode of Musical Talk, presented by Tim Sayward and Thos Ribbits, and edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2017. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can at Musical Talk Thos. Do you want to give me
Here's a little bit of levels check, and here are my levels for today. Levels.
Well, that seems to be on the level.
Jolly good.
Yeah, that seems all fine. How do you want to do this? This will be an insert, so...
I thought we could talk.
You don't think interpretive dance?
I think opening our mouths and emitting some sounds would be the way to approach this.
But my new podcast, Musical Mime, how's that going to work?
Exactly.
Well, thanks very much, Tim, and so we shouldn't cry for it. Hackneyed ending.
Let's try again.
But first, it's Tim Stay. But first, it's Tim Say. But first, it's Tim Staywood. But first, it's Tim Saywood. Yeah.